Dear viewers, thank you for joining us. You're watching OBN Horn of Africa. This is our weekly program, Talk to OBN. In this edition today, we're going to discuss about the current political economy of Ethiopia, and I'm joined by well-known expert, Mr. Zamadena Nagatu, for his expertise. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
All right, I tried to highlight our topic of discussion. We're going to discuss on the current political economy dynamics of Ethiopia, and how do you put it?
First of all, as always, thank you for having me back. As you indicated in your intro, there's the political economic dynamics of Ethiopia can be described on multiple fronts. One will be the changes, the economic reforms that were started about 4 or 5 years ago. That's ongoing. But at the same time, as you know, and as you viewers are very much aware, for the last 2 years, up until November, there was a conflict in the northern part of Ethiopia, which obviously affected the economy. And so that also is being addressed from an economic perspective. Obviously, I'm not a political expert, so I'll leave that to the political experts to discuss it. But at the same time, there are global events that are happening, economic events and geopolitical events that are happening, which also needs to be factored in when we talk about the political economic environment in Ethiopia. So when we take all this into consideration, I suppose we can have a deep dive discussion with you as to what are the key factors that needs to be fast-tracked and addressed, what are the medium prospects, and what are the long-term prospects. So I'm happy to discuss as we go along in this interview.
All right, you vote on the economic reform undergone over the past 5 years, and it's been 5 or so years since reform had undergone. How do you technically or explicitly tell us the reality on the ground? Are you witnessing those reforms undergone on the ground as an expert? So,
right. I think it's important to put things in perspective. As you know, early 2020, the world was hit with COVID. The pandemic affected every country around the world, including Ethiopia. So some of the lingering effects of the pandemic, we can still see it. I just saw a report the other day. I was actually in Washington last week. There was a presentation by the chief economist of the World Bank for Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And he was mapping out a roadmap for Africa in 2023, which includes Ethiopia. And his basic conclusion, at least the World Bank's basic conclusion, is actually the pandemic has retarded Africa's growth, in a very significant way, and will take a number of years to recover. Now, Ethiopia actually, if you look at the data of the economic growth or the economic performance of the economy from 2020 to last year, actually has done relatively better than much of Africa. Okay, even when I'm specifically relating to the impact of COVID, because I'm going to layer these things, each one. Okay, so take into consideration, because you asked me what is the reality on the ground today. I think it's important to go back and see what was it like 3 years ago when the pandemic started, right? So the lingering effect of the pandemic is still there across Africa. The developed world has pretty much recovered because they were able to print trillions of dollars in the United States, trillions of euros in Europe and other parts of the world. But Africa really didn't have that flexibility. But still, I think, relatively speaking, if you look at the World Bank, the IMF, GDP growth numbers for Ethiopia, it's actually been growing even during the pandemic until last year. Secondly, now, and by the Ethiopian government's own disclosure, the conflict in the northern part of Ethiopia, in Tigray, and in parts of Wollo and parts of Afar, primarily in Tigray, but the government estimates that it has at least a $20 billion, it needs at least a $20 billion recovery effort. Okay, that's pretty substantial, right? So, but again, when we talk about that, we still have to put in context that, in my view, considering what was happening, specifically speaking about the economy, it did relatively well. I mean, to grow by 5-6%, even with those kinds of impacts, the conflict, the impact, the lingering effect of COVID, I think. So that's what part of the reality. The third component, as I mentioned in my intro, is the global, what's going on globally. Last year, exactly a year ago, like February, March 2022, if you remember, the Russia-Ukraine conflict erupted, right? So that had a huge impact globally, including in Africa, including in Ethiopia, and specifically, it increased food prices around the world because Russia and Ukraine are major suppliers of food. Oil prices, if you recall, a year ago they were like $120, $125 a barrel. Again, that had an impact also in Ethiopia because Ethiopia is a net oil importer. So these are the three key, what I call the macro, the mega effects of the last 3 years that's had an impact on the Ethiopian economy. Now, considering all this, again, I'm referring to the IMF numbers. The Ethiopian economy grew last year, 5%, something like that, 5.5%. I know the Ethiopian government has a bigger data, a bigger growth number, but whichever one you take, in my view, when you overlay all those three key, mega developments of the last 3.5 years, I would like to think the Ethiopian economy is weathered it as good as one could expect. In fact, better than one would expect. You would have thought maybe it would have been in a recession the last 3 years. It didn't go into a recession, okay? But it's not to discount the challenges that it had faced. But then again, relatively speaking, compared to many other parts of the world, especially in Africa, I think I think it would be an accurate statement to say that it has weathered it fairly well, okay? So now, some of the existing impacts or the ongoing impact, as I said, is inflation. I think it's a fact. Inflation has stayed above 30% for the last, 18 months, maybe even longer. So that, I know the government is developing strategies from what I hear in the media and other places. The government is developing a comprehensive strategy to address the issue of inflation. I know the PM has spoken about it in the parliament in many of his presentations. The Minister of Finance has talked about it. And hopefully soon there'll be some major packages of reforms that will address what I think are structural. The inflation issue in Ethiopia is structural. It didn't happen last year. It didn't start last year or 2 years ago. I mean, if you go back the previous 15 years, on average, inflation in Ethiopia has been about 15%. Now it's a much more elevated level right now. But I think, as I said earlier, this, when it's being addressed holistically, I believe inflation also, which is a main concern for many Ethiopians today, is price increases, especially on basic items like food and other things. But my expectation and my view is that as now the conflict has ended, there's peace on the horizon, and that means there'll be a lot more focus by the government and the private sector on economic activities. That means productivity. We expect productivity to go up. We expect the broader economic activities that one would expect in a normalized environment will resume. That means hopefully inflation will come down, growth will accelerate. We've looked at some of the forecasts for Ethiopia. We've run models, what ifs. And I think if we can sustain the trajectory that we would like Ethiopia to be on from here onwards, okay? A stable environment, peaceful environment, which we think is doable, then there is no reason in the next, say, 24, 25, that it should be able to reach double digits because the fundamentals of the Ethiopian economy are still attractive. It's just that, as I said in the beginning, there were a number of challenges in the last 3.5 years, which didn't allow the economy to be able to achieve its optimal growth targets. Okay, but I think going forward, it should be able to achieve those, and that's the expectation. On top of that,
yeah, Mr. Zamadan, let me pause you here. You've mentioned inflation and the price surge on some items, some commodities in Ethiopia. On the other hand, Ethiopia is one of the fast growing economy in the world. How do you put this irony together? Is that an indication of economic growth, having and seeing that a heat of inflation and price surge of goods and commodities? Is that the character of a fast-growing economy?
So a very good question. I get asked this all the time. How do you reconcile? How can you talk about high inflation, but at the same time high growth? So I don't want to be too technical, but let me, in a fairly simple way, explain how that works. As I said earlier, Ethiopia has a structural inflation challenge. Okay, I mean it's 15% average for the last 15 years. So, and then during that period, when you look at the last 15 years, it's actually been one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And yet we still had double-digit inflation. So part of the problem has always been the imbalance between demand and supply. Okay, fast growth, both the population, the economy, and all that, but the supply of goods and services did not match the growth. That's one of the reasons. And it continues to this day. I mean, listen, for example, the Ethiopian population is increasing by about 3 million net per year. 3 million. We are creating 3 Djiboutis per year. I mean, let me put it this way, okay? Or every 1.5 years, we're creating 1 Norway, but just by our population. So that by itself increases huge demand. But our ability as a country to supply that demand is not there yet. Okay, so that's one of the reasons. The second is imported inflation. We import a lot of stuff in Ethiopia. Now, a lot of it now has to be produced. I know there's a strategy for import substitution that's underway, but we still import a lot of stuff. So we can't control imported inflation. It's just set abroad, especially, as I said, last year when we had wheat prices, grain prices, everything went through the roof. And oil prices, as I said, went through the roof. There was nothing we could do about it. So imported inflation, of course, one of the solutions is as much as possible produce locally. That also, by the way, import substitution also addresses the demand and supply imbalance. Okay. And third, and I've spoken about this many, many times in the past, even I think including one new program and other television programs and interviews, and even posted it on Twitter, my Twitter page, is the wholesale retail distribution system in Ethiopia is still very, very backwards. It is not up to the standards of the 3rd largest economy in sub-Saharan Africa. Ethiopia's, I should have mentioned this, Ethiopia's GDP today is the 3rd largest in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, that's from the IMF, the World Bank data. Okay, and yet, if you look at how we operate the retail system, the distribution system, the wholesale system, the import system, it's probably back from the 1960s and 50s. I mean, it's still very primitive. So if my suggestion to the government would be liberalize it, even to the point of allowing some element of foreign investment into the sector, modernize it. Because the layers that have been created from the producer to the consumer, there's lots of in-betweens. That is creating inefficiencies, is creating margins for everybody else who's not adding any value. That also creates inflation, okay? So those are just some of the big, what I call macro level issues that are contributing to inflation.
Okay, you've said again, Ethiopia is 3rd largest GDP in the sub-Saharan countries, right?
Yes.
What do you mean by? What do you mean by the? Obviously, this acronym represents gross domestic product, right? Technically speaking, what does this show?
All right. So in its simplest form, what it means is there's a term, an economic term called GDP, okay? Gross domestic product, which is the aggregate of all the goods and services produced by a country in that year. Okay, so what Ethiopia produced last year in total in goods and services was about $127 billion, give or take a few billion. Okay, but that's from the IMF World Bank database. It's easily verifiable. So beyond, there's only 2 other countries in Africa who have a bigger sub-Saharan Africa, because this does not include North Africa. Okay, So there's only two other countries in Africa who have a bigger GDP, aggregate GDP, and I'll explain the per capita in a second. But aggregate GDP, Nigeria is the largest with about $500+ billion. It's a big oil producing country. And then next is South Africa, about 350, almost 400 billion. And then the next is Ethiopia. And then after that, it's Kenya. Okay. So in its simplest form, that's what we mean. However, and I need to be very clear about this, that's aggregate GDP. But because our population is the second most populous in Africa after Nigeria, and Nigeria is about 220 million, Ethiopia is about 125 million, give or take a little bit. Okay. So when you divide the 127 billion by 120 million, you get about $1,100, maybe close to $1,200 per capita GDP. This actually is low. Per capita GDP is low. However, and this is the part that I've always been encouraged, that means there's a big room for growth.
Is that similar with per capita income? You mean per capita?
Yes, GDP? Per capita GDP.
Per capita GDP is similar with that of per capita income?
No, I mean it's a misnomer. I think the best way, so as not to confuse your audience.
Okay, go ahead.
The best thing to do is per capita GDP.
Okay, that's another thing.
You take that per capita GDP, not per capita income. Income will then give you different meanings, but in the technical term that everybody, the World Bank, the IMF, and all the international institutions use is per capita GDP. That's a measure of. It doesn't mean every Ethiopian has an average income of $1,200 per year. It just means your total output of the countries, which is the aggregate GDP, divided by the number of people in the country. It gives you an average. By the way, this is the average, okay? So there's some more than that. There's some more, but it's just for comparison. However, what I'm saying is, by the way, it's about what, $1,100-1,200, okay? Now, India, which is now the fifth largest economy in the world, is only about $2,500. So sometimes we need perspective. Yes, we have to increase that. I know the government's 2030 strategy for growth is to double that, maybe to get it to $2,500 by 2030, okay, which is where India is today. But eventually, if we sustain very fast growth, which I think is absolutely doable, okay, which I'm talking about 9, 10, 11% GDP growth. You know what? Sometimes people say, how are we going to do that? I mean, how can Ethiopia do that? Well, China grew by double digits for 40 years in a row, 40 years. And it has 1 billion+ people. So there's no reason why we can't do that. If we're focused, we're determined, we execute as a country our economic strategies, then I don't see any reason why Ethiopia on a sustainable basis cannot grow. Why can't it grow 10 years, 20 years by double digits? Maybe then we come down, because you plateau at a certain point. But so that's why I'm always encouraged about the prospects when I talk about the fundamentals, because that's what's going to drive growth from agriculture, which is untouched. Okay, we're just getting started, right? Agriculture is still the backbone of the Ethiopian economy, but it still needs to be modern as it's started now. Okay, mechanized farming we see all the time in the news and presentations by the government, and some of us have actually gone and seen this. But when you roll that out extensively, agriculture would not only Ethiopia be able to feed itself, but it can actually be an export powerhouse for agriculture. Okay. Second, manufacturing. There is no country on earth. If you look at any economic student or any business student, will tell you there's no country on earth that has become wealthy without manufacturing, except very few small oil wealth countries in the Gulf, in the Middle East, and other places. Very few who become wealthy countries, high-income countries, without a manufacturing base. Everybody else, from South Korea to China, from the United States, everybody else had to produce something. And we are we're sitting pretty as a country, because a lot of years ago, Ethiopia embarked on this migration to industrialization strategy and built all these industrial parks everywhere, right? And the private sector is now starting to go. So we need to accelerate, and we're going to accelerate the manufacturing base. That will create wealth in Ethiopia. So that $2,500 or $3,000 per capita GDP in the next 8-9 years now, we're talking about also we'll be backed by a very strong manufacturing base. Today, as far as I know, I hope I'm not wrong, manufacturing, industrialization, the industrial base of the Ethiopian economy contributes less than, and maybe about 5% or less.
Okay.
If we can double that, then you can see the wealth creation that happens. So when I talk about fundamentals, these are just some of the things that will propel Ethiopia to an upper middle income country by maybe 2030, 2032, something like that. And then, of course, eventually a wealthy country by any measure.
That is too technical for us to say macroeconomic. Can you just, highlight about it as well? And those reforms undergone on the area of macroeconomic indicators.
Macroeconomic is a term that used by economists and others in the business community to describe certain components of the economy. In its simplest form, expanding and the tax base is one of the macroeconomic components that people look at. And also inflation, for example, is a key component. As I said earlier, inflation has a huge damaging effect if it's not managed properly. So addressing, when we talk macroeconomic stability, we include inflation in it, how to address it. Because I worked in many countries where inflation was a big issue. I spent many years in Latin America and Brazil and Argentina, when they were challenged by very high inflationary pressures. So they had what's called macroeconomic instability. So no matter how much economic growth you have, if you don't address that. So these are just some of the key components that people talk about. You hear the word macroeconomic stability is key, and that's important both for domestic investors, foreign investors, for everybody actually, even for the average consumer. Stability. I mean, you look at the exchange rate. Okay, if it's wavering significantly, it makes it difficult to make predictable decisions for investments. Okay, or even for the government to develop a budget. So you need to be careful how you manage your exchange rate. You need to be careful, and this is within the macroeconomic component. So as I said, we don't want to get too technical to make it sound like economic course, but these are just some of the key components that policymakers and the private sector looks at to make informed, reliable decisions.
The Ethiopian government undergone a 10-year perspective plan to make Ethiopia one of the a big economy nation in the world, and to be a beacon of African prosperity by 2030. So far, some initiatives have been seen here and there. Do you think this ambitious plan would be realistically implemented on the ground?
Right. So just for clarity purposes, one of the reform agendas of the government, from what we've seen through the documents that have been distributed and some of the stakeholders meetings that I've certainly participated in over the last year or two, even the homegrown economic reform program that was introduced by the government about 3.5 years ago. One of the key pillars is to bring about a structural transformation of the economy. Okay, not just one or two companies growing or a few things here and there, but overall to make it a more sustainably growing economy. Whereas, for example, if we take agriculture, what does a structural transformation in agriculture mean? Well, we go from first, of course, producing sufficient quantities, not just for ourselves, but for the export. But secondly, most importantly, we need to reduce the percentage of commodity that we export and instead shift to value addition. That's, to me, a structural transformation. Because when you export commodity, you're a price taker. You're not a price influencer or a giver. There's somebody else, like coffee. If we export coffee as good, as beautiful as Ethiopian coffee is, the price is set in New York. Earlier, I talked about import substitution. That's a whole strategy by itself. But value addition, I can tell you, for example, I'm the chairman of a big global multinational clothing manufacturer that manufactures in Ethiopia. The only factory we have in Africa outside of Europe and Asia is here in Ethiopia. Today, we can export as much as we want because there's a huge demand in the global marketplace, and we set the price. Okay, that's what I call structural transformation. We export value-added products. That means we have a global market, unlimited, by the way. The global market is not in the billions; it's in the trillions. Okay, so if we just have our sliver little thing of our fair share as a country, that's what I call it. If we tap into that, then we'll have a structural transformation of the manufacturing sector. Okay, look at the natural resource space, untouched. Ethiopia has apparently all kinds of, from gold to natural gas to oil and other, and it's untapped yet. What we export, what little we export today is the commodity, the unprocessed version. So in the future, first we dig this stuff out of the ground in large quantities, and maybe we start exporting it as a commodity, but eventually we process it right here and export it to the global market. So when we talk about these kinds of, and then of course, one of the things that has been put in the government strategy is the tourism sector. I mean, look, we have the largest airline in Africa based right here in Ethiopia, by far the largest. Okay, that should give us the power to transform the tourism sector. Out of the 14 million passengers that Ethiopian Airlines will transport this year, if we get any 15 or 20% to come and visit Ethiopia, that's 2.5 million a year. That's what I call structural transformation. Last year, I think we brought in 500, 600,000 tourists. So when you pile up all these things, there is no reason why Ethiopia cannot grow by double digits. But the most important asset Ethiopia has, and I've said this many, many times, is its people. Young people who are educatable, trainable, great work ethics, deployable, okay, in large numbers. We have the second largest young workforce in Africa, okay? So the talent, we need to invest in that. I know the last few weeks there's been a lot of discussion about the education sector. That's good. I'm glad it's been given a lot of focus. There are countries who don't produce any of the natural resources that make countries rich, and they're rich today, like South Korea. It doesn't produce a barrel of oil. What did they do? They invested in their people. South Korea today is the 10th or 11th largest economy in the world with only 50 million people because they invested in the people. And Ethiopia's biggest assets, besides all these other things I just mentioned, it's its people, young people. Something like the median age is under 20, less than 20. So 70, 75% of Ethiopians are less than 30 years old. So if we strategize, and that's being done now, is focus on talent that produces world-class products and services, great work ethics, then there's no reason why Ethiopia cannot grow by double digits for the next, I'm not talking about the next decade. No, I'm talking about 2, 3, 4 decades. It's doable. And that's why I'm almost very optimistic about our country's prospects.
Okay. I really appreciate your recommendation, but I need to point out that you've said mechanizing the agriculture and introducing more manufacturing industries and tapping the untapped tourism potential and leveraging the ever existing potential of Ethiopian Airlines and others, the mining sector. But we noticed that some startups have been seen in the agriculture sector. The Ethiopian government recently started exporting wheat.
Specifically to the question you asked me about Ethiopia has started exporting wheat. I want to give some background to it very quickly, which is in Africa, Ethiopia has been the second largest producer of wheat. I think Egypt is the largest producer. However, because our population is very large, and because the way wheat has been produced in Ethiopia, which wasn't very modern until recently, right? We didn't have sufficient quantities for the local market. But now, over the last 3-4 years, there has been a big effort. So I think that's been achieved this year. So it's a big achievement. However, I think as I mentioned previously in my discussions, Ethiopia actually has the capacity to produce not just wheat for export, but fruits, vegetables, anything that the land, the water, the soil that God has given this country in large quantities, by the way. And then I sometimes numbers tell a story. There are 74 million hectares of arable land in Ethiopia, 74 million, of which only about 15 million, maybe 20 million is cultivated today. So we still have another 40, 50 million hectares of land which we can actually deploy, farm, modernize, and to the extent, as I said, we can be a global powerhouse of food exporting. Okay, so wheat is just one of the major examples. It's a very good example because it was symbolic actually for food self-sufficiency. I know there's a lot of debate right now. Should we be exporting wheat or should we be keeping it in the local market? That's a secondary discussion. To me, the self-sufficiency component, the fact that Ethiopia does not spend millions of dollars every year importing wheat, is a very significant milestone. But it's one of many that will be coming, in my view, in the next few years in many of the sectors that we talked about earlier, and in particular, agriculture. So that I think should be how people should view the milestone, the wheat milestone. I mean, remember, years ago when people talked about starting the flour business in Ethiopia, I remember people thought we were crazy, and we were discussing this years ago with some of the government officials and others. I think we say Ethiopia exporting. Today, it's the second largest exporter of flowers. It's the mindset, it's the vision that matters, and I think that's what happened with wheat. We knew we could do it, and it was done. I think we should, as Ethiopians, despite all the debates that I think are secondary, to be honest, should we be exporting it? Should we be keeping it locally? And those are secondary details to me. The fact is, we're not importing wheat anymore as a country, and we're now, I think, there are apparently contracts signed to export it to Kenya and other countries. That's fine. That's good. That's a good milestone. We should actually feel good as Ethiopians, despite some of the other debates that is going on. I know, I'm aware of it, but it's a great milestone.
Okay. Mr. Zamadena Nagatu, thank you for your time and expertise. I really appreciate on behalf of our media house.
Thank you very much, as always, for having me.
Okay, bye. Take care. Okay, viewers, thank you for watching. This brings you the end of our edition for today. See you next time with another edition. Bye-bye. Take care.